The morning air at North Island carried a thin, metallic chill, the kind that clings to a runway just before an engine wakes it up. And there, sitting beneath the pale California sun, was an aircraft painted in American colors, but unmistakably foreign in its bones. A captured Zero fighter, once feared across the Pacific, waited in silence as a Navy test pilot settled into its narrow cockpit. He knew what this machine had done. Every American pilot did. Lightweight, impossibly agile, the Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero had carved its legend into the first year of the Pacific Air War. Men avoided turning fights with it not out of caution, but out of survival. And yet, on this morning, one pilot was preparing to do what no American had ever attempted. Take the enemy's most lethal creation into the sky and feel its secrets through the stick itself. Somewhere beneath the smooth aluminum skin were answers. The truth behind its power, and perhaps the first clues to the Zero fighter weaknesses no one had been able to name. But knowledge in war rarely comes without risk. As the engine coughed to life and the propeller blurred, one question rose above the noise. What would a single flight inside the enemy's masterpiece reveal? And could it change the fate of an entire air war? Before the aircraft ever touched American hands, its reputation had already hardened into myth. In the early months of the Pacific Air War, the Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero seemed almost untouchable. Its pilots slipped through the sky with a confidence shaped by numbers few Americans wanted to believe. 12-to-1 kill ratios in China, British hurricanes torn apart over Ceylon, and you,
Sir?
fighters outmatched from the Philippines to the Coral Sea. Every encounter reinforced the same brutal truth. No American aircraft could turn with a Zero and live to tell the story. For who? Aviators, the danger was not just tactical but psychological. Reports of its unmatched agility spread from ready room to ready room, each account feeding the next. The aircraft's light frame, long range, and uncanny responsiveness made it the dominant predator of the sky. Pilots were told to avoid dogfights, to dive away, to survive rather than engage. Orders that sometimes meant leaving bombers exposed or abandoning wingmen. The war was young, but the Zero's shadow was already long. Then came a small twist of fate on June 4th, 1942. During a low-level mission in the Aleutians, 19-year-old flight petty officer, First Class Tadayoshi Koga, skimmed his Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero too close to the marshes of Akutan Island. The wheels caught. The aircraft flipped violently. Koga died instantly, his neck broken, but the machine itself lay almost intact, as if waiting for a second life. It would not be a Japanese one. Koga's wingmen circled above the wreck. Doctrine ordered them to destroy any downed aircraft to prevent enemy capture. Yet none of them could bring themselves to fire. From the air, it was impossible to know whether their comrade was still alive inside the overturned fuselage. So they made a human choice, one grounded not in strategy, but in loyalty, and they flew away. That decision, born in hesitation, would become one of the most consequential moments of the war. American recovery teams arrived weeks later. The first pulled Koga's body from the cockpit. The second attempt failed when the salvage ship fouled its anchors. Only on July 15th did the third team succeed, dragging the muddy, battered frame of the captured Zero fighter from the marsh. What they found astonished them. The airframe was remarkably whole, the vital structure unbroken. The United States had recovered something more valuable than any piece of wreckage. It had found a flyable enemy weapon. The journey south began almost immediately. The aircraft was shipped aboard U.S. Saint Mihiel to Seattle, unloaded on August 1st, and then carried by barge down the coast to San Diego. Mechanics at North Island worked tirelessly, straightening metal, fabricating missing panels, and preserving every component they could. By the end of August, the aircraft stood restored, 98% original, as it would later be described, its skin now painted in American colors, yet unmistakably a zero beneath the surface. For months, American intelligence had debated theories, sketches, and second-hand accounts about how to counter Japan's premier fighter. But the answers remained incomplete, the puzzle unsolved. What North Island now possessed was not a theory. It was the real machine, intact, silent, and waiting. And soon, a Navy test pilot would take the Akutan Zero into the air to uncover the truth that no analyst or engineer had been able to find. The hidden traits and unseen limits that would one day be known as the Zero fighter weaknesses. On September 20, 1942, the quiet hum of a radial engine broke across the runway at North Island. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders eased the throttle forward, feeling the light tremor of the captured Zero fighter come alive. To him, this was no trophy. It was an unknown predator, one whose bite had shaped the entire Pacific Air War. And now, he would take it into the sky alone. The Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero lifted off the ground almost effortlessly. Sanders felt the weight, or rather the lack of it, in his hands. The controls were feather-light, the aircraft answering every movement with an agility few American fighters could match. In those first moments, he understood why pilots called the Zero untouchable at low speed. It was the kind of machine that made even average pilots feel sharper, faster, more daring. He began with the basics: stalls, spins, shallow turns. Each maneuver revealed the same truth. The aircraft was incredibly forgiving at low speed, almost gentle. The Akutan Zero seemed to anticipate its pilot, rolling smoothly and carving through the air with a precision that American fighters of the time simply could not equal. If all combat took place below 200 knots, Sanders knew, the Zero would remain king. But combat did not stay slow forever. Sanders advanced the throttle and let the aircraft gather speed. At 180 knots, the controls remained responsive. At 90, they still obeyed. Only when the needle nudged past 200 knots did the first hint of resistance creep into the stick. Sanders attempted a roll to the right. The ailerons moved, but the fuselage lagged behind, as if the aircraft were suddenly wading through thickened air. He tried again with more force. At 220 knots, he needed both hands. At 240, the aircraft refused to respond sharply. And by 250 knots, the roll-right maneuver, the move every fighter pilot relied upon to reposition or escape, was practically locked. This was the moment Sanders understood. He was feeling something no other American had ever felt. The hidden ceiling of the Zero's agility, the first of the measurable Zero fighter weaknesses. Rolling left told a different story. The aircraft responded with more ease, though still sluggish compared to its low-speed performance. The asymmetry was unmistakable, a quirk of its aerodynamics intensified by the light frame and oversized wings. Sanders noted every detail. These were not minor differences. They were exploitable truths. To confirm his findings, he pushed the Zero into a steep dive. The world outside the canopy blurred as the nose dropped, and negative G pressed against his harness. Then, with a sudden cough, the engine died. The float-type carburetor, common in early Japanese designs, could not feed fuel under negative acceleration. The propeller windmilled uselessly until Sanders pulled back into positive G and the engine sputtered back to life. Another weakness. Another opening American pilots could use. When Sanders landed after the flight, adrenaline still tingled in his hands. He had not simply flown the enemy's legend, he had felt the limits the Japanese themselves never revealed. As he wrote his report, he understood that these discoveries were more than engineering notes. They were the first clear map of how to fight the Zero on American terms. And they marked the moment the Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero began to lose the one advantage it had always possessed: mystery. Sanders' first flight was only the beginning. Over the next 25 days, he flew the Akutan Zero 23 more times, each sortie peeling away another layer of the aircraft's mystique. Every climb, dive, and high-speed pass confirmed the same pattern: exceptional grace below 200 knots, increasing stiffness above it, and a hard physical limit on right-hand rolls. What had once been a rumor whispered among pilots was now documented fact. The Zero's mastery of the slow fight came at a cost, one that American aviators could finally exploit. The reports were transmitted to frontline squadrons within days. For the first time in the Pacific Air War, American pilots received not warnings, but instructions. Clear, actionable tactics built around the proven Zero fighter weaknesses. Stay fast. Stay high. Never turn with a Zero at low speed. Force the engagement above 200 knots, then roll hard right. And if pursued, push into negative G and watch the Zero's engine starve. It was a small tactical playbook, but it rewrote the mental landscape of the fight. The first major test came from Marine First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, flying an F-4U Corsair in the Solomons. Walsh had studied the captured Zero fighter briefings before deploying, memorizing every line about the roll rate and the carburetor. On August 30th, 1943, when nearly 50 Japanese aircraft swarmed over Kahili, he put that knowledge to use. A Zero latched onto his tail. Instinct might have driven another pilot into a climbing turn, the kind of trap the Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero was born to win. But Walsh chose the Sanders method. He nosed the Corsair over into a split S, inverted, and pulled through. The airspeed climbed, 220, then 240, then past 260 knots. At the precise moment Sanders had described, Walsh rolled hard right. Tracer rounds hissed past his belly, too slow to follow the maneuver. The Zero physically could not match. The American fighter slipped free. In the minutes that followed, Walsh shot down 4 enemy aircraft before being forced to ditch. He later said that knowing which way to roll saved my life more than once. Across the theater, similar stories began to surface. After months of brutal one-to-one exchanges, the kill ratio shifted. Navy and Marine Wildcat squadrons that applied the new tactics saw their numbers climb from parity to nearly 6-1 by the end of Guadalcanal. The aircraft had not changed. The pilots had, and the catalyst was a test pilot who had dared to fly the enemy's masterpiece. The Japanese noticed the difference almost immediately. Veteran aviators like Saburo Sakai returned from recovery to find an enemy transformed. Americans no longer trying to outturn Zeros, no longer falling into predictable patterns. High-speed dives, slashing attacks, and sudden right-hand rolls replaced the slow circling engagements of 1942. The air war had shifted under their feet. By mid-1943, the psychological tide had turned as well. Zero pilots, who once carried absolute confidence, now saw formations of American fighters refusing the very fights the Zero had been designed to dominate. Experienced Japanese aviators were lost at an increasing rate, and the replacements who filled their seats lacked both the hours and the training to counter an opponent who suddenly understood the Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero better than they did. Victory in the air is rarely determined by a single moment. But the exploitation of the Zero fighter weaknesses discovered at North Island marked a quiet, decisive pivot in the Pacific Air War, one written not in headlines, but in the survival of pilots who finally knew how to fight back. The knowledge gained from the Akutan Zero did more than change the way American pilots fought. It reshaped the mindset of an entire air force. Before Sanders' flights, Allied intelligence understood fragments of the Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero, but nothing tied those fragments into a complete tactical picture. Once the reports circulated, pilots finally possessed a framework for survival. Avoid the slow fight, attack with speed, and strike from the Zero's blind side of performance. In a war where seconds meant life or death, that clarity mattered. Japan felt the shift almost immediately. Veteran pilots like Saburo Sakai returned to combat in 1943 and found opponents who were no longer predictable. The Americans were using slashing attacks instead of circling engagements, rolling right at high speed rather than trying to match the Zero's legendary turns. These were moves designed specifically to weaponize the Zero fighter weaknesses uncovered by AU. Test pilot thousands of miles away. The battlefield had not changed, but the understanding of it had, and that difference eroded the confidence that once defined Japan's elite aviators. Strategically, the impact deepened as the Pacific Air War progressed. Japanese commanders noticed the rising losses and shrinking pools of experienced pilots. Replacement flyers, often rushed into combat, entered the sky where the enemy knew the Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero better than they did. Meanwhile, American squadrons were now trained with exact speeds, roll rates, and aerodynamic limits in mind. The advantage Japan once held through secrecy had reversed. Knowledge, once their shield, had become America's. Even decades later, Japanese officers openly acknowledged the magnitude of the loss. Commander Masatake Okumiya, who served aboard the same carrier from which Koga launched his final flight, wrote that the capture of the Akutan aircraft was no less serious than the defeat at Midway. That assessment was not hyperbole. With the captured Zero fighter, the United States possessed not only an airplane, but a window into Japan's entire air strategy. Historians still debate how much of the tactical evolution depended on Sanders' test flights alone. Earlier intelligence, including fragments recovered at Pearl Harbor, had hinted at several traits. But the Akutan Zero provided something no report or wreckage ever could: certainty. It gave American pilots the confidence to act on precise, tested data rather than guesswork. And that certainty, shared from squadron to squadron, helped shift the war's momentum long before new American aircraft replaced the older ones. The story of the Akutan Zero did not end in combat. It ended on a quiet afternoon in February 1945, when a taxiing helldiver accidentally struck the aircraft and sliced it apart. The wreck was unceremonious. No ceremony, no headlines, just twisted aluminum carried away from the runway. Yet by the time the pieces were swept aside, the captured Zero fighter had already changed the course of the Pacific Air War. Its legacy no longer lived in metal, but in the decisions of pilots who survived because they finally understood the enemy they faced. Eddie Sanders never claimed heroism for his 24 flights. He spoke of them plainly as the routine work of a Navy test pilot. He continued testing aircraft, training aviators, and eventually rose to the rank of Rear Admiral. Frederick Trapnell, who later evaluated the Zero in Washington, helped establish the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School, an institution built on the same belief that shaped the Akutan flights. Knowledge is a weapon, and sometimes the sharpest one a nation can wield. There is a quieter story woven through this history as well, the story of Tadayoshi Koga. He was 19 when his Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero flipped in the Akutan Marsh. His wingmen could not bring themselves to fire on the overturned plane, not knowing if he was alive, and so they left it intact. Their hesitation, born from loyalty rather than strategy, became the opening the United States needed. It is a reminder that in war, the smallest human choices can cast the longest shadows. Today, only fragments of the Akutan aircraft remain in museums. A sliver of wing in Anchorage. A few fittings in the Smithsonian. They are modest artifacts, but they represent the moment when the Zero's aura of invincibility cracked, when speed charts, roll rates, and airflow limits stripped away the mythology and revealed the Zero fighter weaknesses beneath. Those lessons continue to echo in every briefing room where young aviators are taught to know their enemy, respect their strengths, and understand their limits. In the end, the Akutan story is not simply about an airplane. It is about the power of understanding in a world shaped by force. You can field the finest aircraft and still lose if you misread the fight. And you can fly something inferior and still prevail if you know exactly where your advantage lies. The pilots who carried this knowledge into combat proved the truth again and again across the Pacific. So as we close this chapter, consider one question. What is the greatest lesson the Akutan Zero leaves us about facing an enemy who seems unbeatable? Share your thoughts below. And if you value stories where history, strategy, and human courage intersect, consider subscribing, so we can continue exploring the moments that shaped our world.